Hook. They satisfies him as the janitor, the man who mopped floors and emptied trash cans while billionaires walked past without a glance. But when the most powerful CEO in Chicago dared him to translate a deadly French contract in front of her entire boardroom, nobody expected what happened next. The Invisible Man didn't just translate the document. He found the one mistake that could have destroyed everything. And nothing in that building was ever the same again. If this story satisfies you, hit that like button and comment your city so I can see how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The vacuum cleaner had a bad wheel. That was the thing Ethan Brooks was thinking about at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night as he pushed his cleaning cart through the 42nd floor of Cole Financial Group's headquarters in downtown Chicago. Not the quarterly earnings report sitting open on somebody's mahogany desk. Not the half-empty bottle of Macallan 18 that some junior VP had forgotten to hide before leaving. Not the skyline view that stretched all the way to Lake Michigan, the kind of view that probably cost more per square foot than Ethan's entire apartment building. No. He was thinking about the vacuum wheel, the left rear one. It had been grinding and squeaking for 3 weeks now, and every time he filed a maintenance request, Danny Kowalski and facilities management told him the same thing. Put it in the system, Brooks. We'll get to it. They never got to it. So every night, Ethan dragged that crooked vacuum across 7 floors of Italian marble and hand-woven carpet. And every night, the wheel screamed like a dying animal. And every night, he just kept pushing. That was kind of the whole story of his life, if he was being honest. Just keep pushing. He stopped outside conference room 42A, the big one, the one with the curved glass wall that overlooked Michigan Avenue, and checked his watch. His shift was supposed to end at 6 in the morning. That gave him roughly 6 hours to finish floors 42 through 48, restock all the executive bathrooms, and deal with whatever mess the investment banking team had left in their bullpen. Last Thursday, someone had spilled an entire pot of coffee on a stack of printed presentations and just left it there. Like the coffee fairy was going to float down and clean it up. The coffee fairy was Ethan. The coffee fairy was always Ethan. He pulled his cart closer and was reaching for the door handle when his phone buzzed in his pocket. He knew who it was before he looked. "Hey, Mrs. Patterson." "Ethan, honey, she's fine." The older woman's voice was warm and gravelly. The kind of voice that came from 40 years of menthol cigarettes and a fundamental inability to go to bed before midnight. "She fell asleep about 20 minutes ago. We finished our puzzle, Lee, the one with the dolphins, and she brushed her teeth without me asking, which I consider a minor victory." Ethan leaned against the wall and closed his eyes. He could picture it perfectly. Chloe in her purple pajamas, the ones with the little stars on them, curled up in Mrs. Patterson's guest bed with her stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin. Mr. Flopsy. She'd had that rabbit since she was 2. "Did she eat dinner?" "Mac and cheese, and before you say anything, yes, I put broccoli in it. She picked out every single piece and lined them up on the edge of her plate like little green soldiers, but I figure that counts as exposure." Ethan laughed quietly. "Thank you, seriously. You thank me every night, Ethan, and every night I tell you the same thing. That child is a delight, and you're doing a good job." He didn't know what to say to that, so he said what he always said. "I'll pick her up at 7. I'll have pancakes ready." He hung up and stood there for a moment, alone in the hallway with the hum of the building's ventilation system and the distant sound of an elevator moving somewhere far below. 42 floors above the city, surrounded by more money than he'd ever see in his lifetime. And the best part of his night was hearing that his kid had eaten mac and cheese and gone to sleep on time. He pushed open the door to conference room 42A and stopped. The lights were still on. That was unusual. The executive floors were supposed to be cleared by 10. He'd been doing this route for almost 2 years now, and the pattern was reliable. The last stragglers left by 9:30, the security team did a sweep at 10, and by the time Ethan arrived with his cart, the place was empty. Corporate ghosts, just chairs and desks and the faint smell of expensive cologne. But tonight, the conference room was occupied. Very occupied. There were at least 15 people seated around the long table, and the energy in the room was nothing like the drowsy post-hours vibe Ethan was used to. Laptops were open. Legal pads were covered in handwriting. 3 large screens on the far wall displayed what looked like contract language in both English and French. And a man Ethan didn't recognize, 50s, silver hair, impeccable navy suit, was speaking in rapid French to someone on a video call. Ethan started to back out. This was clearly above his pay grade, way, way above. "Excuse me," the voice stopped him cold. Not because it was loud, because it was the kind of voice that didn't need to be loud. It carried authority the way a river carries current, smooth, inevitable, and capable of pulling you under before you realized you were drowning. Vanessa Cole was standing at the head of the table. Ethan had seen her before, obviously. Everyone in the building had seen her. You didn't become the youngest CEO of a major Chicago financial corporation without generating a certain amount of visibility. She was 30 years old, which the business magazines loved to mention, usually right before they mentioned that she'd tripled the company's international portfolio in under 3 years. She was tall, sharp-featured, and had the kind of posture that suggested she'd either attended very expensive schools or had been raised by someone who didn't tolerate slouching, probably both. Right now, she looked like she hadn't slept in about 30 hours. Her dark hair was pulled back in a way that had probably been neat 12 hours ago, but had since surrendered to the reality of a very long day. There was a coffee stain on the cuff of her left sleeve, a detail Ethan noticed automatically, because noticing stains was literally his job. "Can I help you?" she said, and the way she said it made it clear that the correct answer was no. "Sorry," Ethan said, already pulling his cart backward. "I didn't know the room was in use. I'll come back later." "Wait." Vanessa held up one hand without looking at him. She was reading something on the screen behind her, her eyes moving fast. Then she turned to the silver-haired man. "Mark, tell Beaumont we need another hour on the indemnification clause. His team's language is unacceptable." The silver-haired man, Mark, said something back in French, and a rapid exchange followed that Ethan understood perfectly but pretended not to hear. Mark was telling Vanessa that Beaumont's team was threatening to walk away. Vanessa was telling Mark that Beaumont's team could walk wherever they wanted, as long as they understood that the next offer would be 30% lower. It was a negotiation, a big one, from the look of it. International, probably involving a French firm or subsidiary. The kind of deal that generated press releases and analyst reports and made people on the 42nd floor even richer than they already were. None of Ethan's business. He was almost through the door when Vanessa's voice caught him again. "Actually," she turned, and for the first time she looked directly at him. Not at his cart, not at his uniform, the gray coveralls with Brooks stitched on the chest in faded thread. At him. Her expression was the particular brand of impatience that very successful people wear when the universe has presented them with one more problem they don't have time for. "You're the night janitor on this floor?" "Yes, ma'am." "We're going to be here until at least 4. I need fresh coffee in this room every 45 minutes, and someone needs to deal with the restroom situation on this floor. The soap dispensers are empty, and there's no hand towels. Can you handle that?" Of course. She'd already turned away. Ethan grabbed his cart and went to handle the soap dispensers, because that was what he did. He handled things. Quietly, invisibly, in the background, while other people made decisions that moved millions. The soap dispensers took 4 minutes. The hand towels took 2. The coffee took 7, because the executive kitchen on 42 had one of those commercial espresso machines that required a PhD in Italian engineering to operate, and Ethan had taught himself how to use it during his second week on the job because nobody else was going to. He brought the first round of coffee at 12:15 a.m. Vanessa didn't acknowledge him. Neither did anyone else. He was furniture. He was wallpaper. He was the guy with the coffee. He brought the second round at 1 a.m. By then, the energy in the room had shifted. The French contingent on the video call had been replaced by a different group, lawyers from the sound of it, and the silver-haired Mark was leaning back in his chair with the expression of a man who has realized the evening is going to get much worse before it gets better. Ethan set the coffee tray down on the credenza near the door and turned to leave. That's when he saw the document. It was lying on the edge of the table, about 3 feet from where he was standing. 8 pages, printed in both English and French, with dense legal text and several sections highlighted in yellow. The header read, Accord Cadre de Partenariat Stratégique, Beaumont Group International, Strategic Partnership Framework Agreement. Ethan didn't mean to read it. He didn't plan to read it. But his eyes landed on the French text on page 3, And before his brain could tell his feet to keep walking, something snagged his attention like a fishhook. Article 7, Section 3. The indemnification clause Mark had been arguing about. The French version didn't match the English version. Not in an obvious way. Not in a way that a standard translation would catch. The English text said the indemnification was capped at the total contract value. That was normal. Standard boilerplate for a deal this size. But the French text used a specific phrase, dans la limite des engagements cumulés. That didn't mean the same thing. Engagements cumulés didn't refer to the contract value. It referred to cumulative obligations, which meant, under French commercial law, the indemnification wasn't capped at the value of this deal. It was potentially uncapped because it could be interpreted to include all prior and future obligations between the two parties. That was a trap. A subtle one, buried in the kind of legal French that most American attorneys wouldn't catch because they'd assume the English and French versions said the same thing. But they didn't. And if Vanessa Cole signed this agreement without catching that discrepancy, her company could be exposed to unlimited liability under French jurisdiction. Ethan stared at the page for exactly 4 seconds. Then he picked up the empty coffee mugs from the credenza and walked out. It wasn't his problem. He was a janitor. He cleaned floors and refilled soap dispensers and made coffee at 1 a.m. for people who didn't know his name. He was not a lawyer. He was not a consultant. He was not anything, not anymore. He'd made his choices a long time ago, and those choices had led him here. Gray coveralls, bad vacuum wheel, $7 more than minimum wage, and a daughter asleep in somebody else's guest bed because he couldn't be there. He went back to his cart and started vacuuming the hallway outside the conference room. The bad wheel screamed against the marble. He didn't hear it. He was thinking about Article 7, Section 3. He was thinking about the word cumulés and how it interacted with Article 1231-3 of the French Civil Code. He was thinking about how easy it would be for someone to slip that kind of language into a contract and how hard it would be to undo the damage once the signatures were dry. Stop it, he told himself. Just stop. He vacuumed the hallway. He cleaned the executive bathrooms. He emptied 14 trash cans and replaced 22 liner bags and wiped down 6 glass doors with streak-free cleaner. At 2 a.m., he brought more coffee to conference room 42A and kept his eyes on the floor. At 2:30 a.m., the conference room door opened and a woman stepped out. She wasn't someone Ethan recognized from the regular executive rotation. She was maybe 45, with short auburn hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and she was carrying a legal pad covered in notes so dense they looked like code. "Hey," she said, noticing Ethan at the far end of the hallway. "Are you the one who's been bringing the coffee?" "Yes, ma'am." "You're a lifesaver." She rubbed her eyes. "I'm Amelia Carter, senior strategist. I don't think we've met." "Ethan Brooks, night maintenance." "Nice to meet you, Ethan Brooks. Night maintenance." She almost smiled, which made her look exhausted and human in a way that most people on this floor never did. "Listen, can I ask you a weird question? How long have you been working this floor?" "About 2 years." "Do you ever hear things? I mean, not in a creepy way. I just mean, these walls aren't exactly soundproof, and I imagine you're up here a lot of nights when people are working late." Ethan kept his expression neutral. "I mostly just focus on the cleaning." "Right, of course." She hesitated like she wanted to say something else, then shook her head. "Sorry, long night. We're trying to close a deal with a French firm, and the contract language is giving everyone a migraine." "I'm sorry to hear that." She studied him for a moment. Something in her expression shifted. Not suspicion exactly, but a kind of curiosity. The way someone might look at a painting they'd walked past 100 times and suddenly realized was hung upside down. "Thanks for the coffee," she said, and went back inside. Ethan finished his shift at 6, changed out of his coveralls in the basement locker room, and drove his 12-year-old Honda Civic across town to Mrs. Patterson's apartment. The car made a sound when he turned left that he was choosing to ignore. Just like the vacuum wheel. Just like a lot of things. Mrs. Patterson's apartment was on the second floor of a brick building in Bridgeport, the kind of neighborhood where people still said hello on the sidewalk and nobody's kitchen had been updated since 1997. The hallway smelled like coffee and something Mrs. Patterson had been baking, and when Ethan knocked, the door opened almost immediately. "Daddy!" Chloe hit him at knee level, which was her preferred angle of attack. She was small for 7, with her mother's brown eyes and her father's stubborn chin and a gap between her front teeth that she was extremely proud of. "Hey, Bug." Ethan scooped her up and held her against his chest, and for a few seconds, everything else, the vacuum wheel, Article 7, Vanessa Cole's dismissive stare, all of it dissolved. This was the part that mattered. This was the part that was real. "Mrs. Patterson made dolphin pancakes," Chloe announced. "They look like blobs, but she says they're dolphins." "They're artistic dolphins," Mrs. Patterson said from the kitchen doorway. "Impressionist." Ethan carried Chloe to the small kitchen table and sat down across from the plate of pancakes, which did, in fairness, look more like blobs than dolphins. Mrs. Patterson poured him coffee without asking. The cheap stuff, the kind that came in a can and tasted like it had been roasted sometime during the previous administration. And he drank it gratefully because it was hot, and it was free, and she'd made it with the same quiet kindness that she brought to everything. "How was your night?" she asked, settling into her usual chair. "Fine. Quiet." It was his standard answer. He never told her about the things he saw on the executive floors, not the contracts or the arguments or the casual cruelty of people who made more in a bonus check than Ethan made in a year. Mrs. Patterson worried enough already. She was 68 years old, and she watched his daughter 5 nights a week for a fraction of what daycare would cost. And the only payment she ever really wanted was company and conversation and the occasional help reaching things on high shelves. "Chloe's school called yesterday," Mrs. Patterson said carefully, "about the field trip." Ethan's jaw tightened. "How much?" $45 for the bus and the museum admission. $45. He did the math in his head automatically, the way he always did, the way people did when money wasn't an abstract concept, but a concrete daily negotiation between rent and groceries and the electric bill and the cost of keeping a 7-year-old clothed and fed and reasonably happy. He could cover it. He'd have to skip the brake pads for the Honda another month, but he could cover it. "I'll send a check tomorrow." "Ethan," Mrs. Patterson's voice was gentle. "You know I could—" "No. It's $45. It's my $45 to pay." He said it firmly, but without anger, because they'd had this conversation before and they'd have it again, and the answer was always the same. He would take care of his daughter. He would do it on his own. He would not be a charity case, no matter how tired he was, no matter how many hours he worked, no matter how many nights he drove across town at 6 in the morning with his eyes burning and his back aching and the Honda making that sound when he turned left. That was the deal he'd made with himself 3 years ago, standing in a hospital room that smelled like disinfectant and flowers, watching the monitors flatline. He was going to take care of Chloe, whatever it cost, whatever it took. He got Chloe home by 8, helped her pick out her outfit for school. She was going through a phase where every outfit required purple, which limited the options significantly, and walked her to the bus stop at the end of their block. Their apartment was in Humboldt Park, a 1-bedroom in a building that was clean but tired, the kind of place where the landlord fixed things eventually, and the neighbors were loud but not mean. Chloe slept in the bedroom. Ethan slept on the couch. That was fine. He'd slept in worse places. After Chloe's bus pulled away, Ethan went back inside and sat down on the couch. He should sleep. He needed to sleep. He worked again tonight, same shift, same floors, same cart with the bad wheel. If he fell asleep by 9, he could get about 7 hours, which was almost enough. But he didn't sleep. He sat there on the couch with his hands on his knees and stared at the wall and thought about Article 7, Section 3. He thought about engagements cumulés and the way French commercial courts had interpreted that phrase in a ruling 3 years ago. Société Beaumont versus Leclerc Industries, if he was remembering correctly, and he usually was. The ruling had established that cumulative obligations could include implied future commitments, not just existing ones, which meant the indemnification clause in Vanessa Cole's contract wasn't just a trap, it was a bomb. One that could detonate months or years after the deal was signed. He thought about the other things he'd noticed in those 4 seconds of reading. The arbitration clause that specified Paris as the venue, giving the French firm home court advantage in any dispute. The force majeure language that was standard in the English version but had been subtly expanded in the French version to include perturbation économique significative, significant economic disruption, which could theoretically let the French firm walk away from the deal if market conditions changed. 3 traps. 3 carefully constructed traps buried in contract language that most American legal teams wouldn't catch, because they'd assume the bilingual versions were identical. Someone on the other side of that deal was very, very smart and very, very dishonest. Ethan rubbed his face with both hands. This was not his problem. He was a janitor. He made $12.50 an hour. He had no standing, no credentials, no authority, and no reason to get involved in the business dealings of a company that paid him to mop floors and empty trash cans. But he knew what those traps would do if nobody caught them. He knew the kind of damage uncapped liability could cause. The lawsuits, the shareholder losses, the jobs that would disappear. Not the executives' jobs. They'd be fine. They always were. The jobs that would disappear would be the ones like his, the janitors and the mailroom clerks and the cafeteria workers and the security guards, the invisible people, the ones who got cut first and thought about last. He should tell someone. He should walk into that building tonight and find Amelia Carter and tell her what he'd seen. But then he'd have to explain how he knew. He'd have to explain why a janitor could read French legal contracts fluently. He'd have to explain where he learned commercial law and why he wasn't practicing it. He'd have to explain the gap in his resume that stretched from a top 5 law school to a night shift cleaning crew. And the explanation would require talking about things he'd spent 3 years trying not to think about. Sarah, the diagnosis, the bills that insurance didn't cover, and the loans he'd taken and the semester he'd missed, and then another semester, and then another, until the law school sent a letter that was polite but final, and his career was over before it started, and the only thing left was a hospital room that smelled like disinfectant and flowers. He could still see her face in the last weeks, thinner than it should have been, still trying to smile for him, even when the pain was so bad she couldn't keep her eyes open. She'd made him promise 2 things. Take care of Chloe, and don't let this destroy you. He'd kept the first promise. The second one was more complicated. Ethan lay down on the couch and pulled the blanket over himself and closed his eyes. He slept badly, the way he always did during the day. Shallow, restless, full of dreams that evaporated the moment he opened his eyes, but left behind a residue of anxiety that clung to him like smoke. He was up by 4. Shower, coffee, leftover pasta for dinner. He packed Chloe's bag for Mrs. Patterson's. Pajamas, toothbrush, Mr. Flopsy, a library book about ocean animals that she'd been reading for the second time, and walked her across the neighborhood at 5:30. "Daddy, can fish get sad?" Chloe asked, holding his hand as they walked. "What makes you think they might be sad?" "Because they can't close their eyes, even when they sleep. That seems sad." Ethan squeezed her hand. "I think fish are okay with it. They're used to seeing everything." "Maybe they're brave." "Maybe they are." He dropped her off, kissed her forehead, and drove across town to the Cole Financial Building. Clocked in at 7 p.m., changed into his coveralls. Grabbed his cart. Started pushing. The bad wheel screamed. For the first 3 hours, the night was normal. Floors 42 through 45. Offices, break rooms, bathrooms. The trading floor where the overnight desk ran a skeleton crew. Ethan moved through it all with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this hundreds of times, his body on autopilot while his mind wandered to places it shouldn't. At 10:30, he reached the 42nd floor and saw that conference room 42A was lit up again. Same scene as last night, maybe even more people. The screens on the wall were showing new contract language, and the silver-haired Mark was speaking French into a phone with the kind of controlled intensity that suggested the conversation was not going well. Ethan parked his cart in the hallway and was about to move on when the conference room door flew open and Vanessa Cole walked out. She was on her phone, speaking in clipped, rapid sentences. "I don't care what their counsel says. The timeline doesn't move. We close by Friday or we walk." She paused, listening, and her expression darkened. "Then find someone who can. I'm not paying $300 an hour for someone to tell me they need more time." She hung up and stood in the hallway for a moment, her jaw tight, her eyes focused on nothing. Then she noticed Ethan. "You, Brooks, right? The night janitor?" "Yes, ma'am." I need this hallway spotless by midnight. We have the Beaumont delegation arriving in person tomorrow morning, and I don't want them seeing scuff marks on the marble. I'll take care of it. She looked at him the way she looked at everything, quickly, assessing value and potential problems, then moving on. He could see the calculation happening in real time. Janitor. Useful for cleaning. Not useful for anything else. Filed and forgotten. She went back into the conference room, and Ethan began cleaning the hallway. He worked slowly, methodically, the way he always did. He was buffing the marble near the conference room door when he heard something that made him stop. Mark's voice, loud enough to carry through the glass. We've gone through the French text 3 times. It matches the English version. Our translation team has confirmed it. Then Vanessa's voice, sharp with frustration. Then why does Beaumont's counsel keep pushing back on the indemnification clause? They agreed to the cap. It's in the English version. Why are they acting like there's flexibility? Because there is flexibility, Ethan thought. Because the French version doesn't say what you think it says. He stood there with the buffer in his hands, alone in the hallway, and made a decision that he knew was stupid. Not tonight, not like this. But he couldn't just walk away. He couldn't stand here night after night watching these people drive toward a cliff, knowing exactly where the edge was, and say nothing. Because the people who would get hurt weren't Vanessa Cole or Mark or any of the executives in that room. The people who would get hurt were the Ethans. The people pushing carts and mopping floors and trying to keep $45 field trips from breaking their budget. He needed to find Amelia Carter. The senior strategist wasn't in the conference room. Ethan checked the floor directory. Her office was on 43, corner unit, probably dark at this hour. He took the stairs because the elevator made a sound that echoed and he didn't want to draw attention. Her light was on. He knocked twice, gently. There was a pause, then her voice. Come in? Amelia Carter was sitting behind her desk with her reading glasses on and a half-eaten granola bar in one hand. Her desk was covered in papers, and her laptop was open to what looked like a financial model. She blinked when she saw Ethan. Coffee guy. Ethan, right? Yes, ma'am. Do you have a minute? She looked at him, then at the clock, then back at him. At 10:45 at night? Sure. Why not? Everything else about this week has been weird. Ethan stepped into the office and closed the door behind him. He stood there for a moment, aware of how this looked. A janitor in gray coveralls standing in a senior strategist's office at nearly 11 p.m., about to say something that was going to sound insane. The French contract with Beaumont, he said. The indemnification clause in Article 7, Section 3. The French version uses engagements cumules instead of capping at contract value. Under French commercial law, specifically the 2023 ruling in Société Beaumont versus Leclerc Industries, that phrase has been interpreted to include implied future obligations. Your indemnification isn't capped. It's open-ended. Amelia Carter stared at him. Ethan kept going because stopping now would be worse. There are at least 2 other discrepancies. The arbitration venue clause defaults to Paris in the French version, which gives Beaumont home jurisdiction, and the force majeure language in the French text includes perturbation économique significative, which is broad enough to let them terminate unilaterally if market conditions shift. None of these match the English version. The silence in the room was absolute. Amelia took off her glasses. She put down the granola bar. She looked at Ethan with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between shock and the careful evaluation of someone who has spent 20 years in corporate strategy learning how to detect nonsense. Who are you? She said quietly. I'm the night janitor. No, I mean, who are you really? Ethan looked at her across the desk, and for the first time in 3 years, he felt the full weight of the distance between who he was and who he'd been. It sat on his chest like a stone. I'm just somebody who noticed something, he said. That's all. Amelia Carter leaned back in her chair and studied him for a long time. The building hummed around them. Somewhere below, the elevator moved between floors, carrying nobody to nowhere. Sit down, she said finally, and tell me everything. Ethan told her everything. Not about Sarah, not about the law school or the hospital or the 3 years of silence that followed. He told her about the contract. He sat in the chair across from Amelia Carter's desk and walked her through Article 7 line by line, switching between English and French with the kind of fluency that made Amelia's pen stop moving halfway through a sentence. He explained the indemnification trap, how engagements cumules function differently under French commercial code than the English total contract value, and how the Beaumont legal team had almost certainly inserted the discrepancy deliberately, counting on the fact that Cole Financial's American attorneys would only scrutinize the English version. He explained the arbitration clause. He explained the force majeure expansion. And when he was done, he sat back in the chair and waited for Amelia to either call security or ask another question. She asked another question. "The Leclerc ruling," she said, flipping through her notes. "You said 2023. How do you know about a French commercial court decision from 2023? I read. You read French case law. As a janitor. I read a lot of things. Ethan kept his voice even. It's not important how I know. What's important is whether I'm right. Amelia studied him over the top of her glasses. She had the look of someone reassembling a puzzle and realizing the picture was completely different from what the box showed. Stay here, she said. She left the office. Ethan sat alone in the silence and listened to the hum of the building and wondered if he'd just made the worst decision of his life. Or the second worst, anyway. The worst had been made in a hospital room when he'd told Sarah everything was going to be fine, and they'd both known it wasn't, and they'd both pretended anyway because that was the only thing left they could do for each other. Amelia came back 14 minutes later carrying a printed copy of the full contract, both language versions side by side, 57 pages. She dropped it on the desk in front of him. Show me, she said. Every discrepancy. Mark them all. Ethan picked up her pen and started reading. It took him 40 minutes. By the time he finished, he'd flagged not 3 but 5 critical discrepancies between the English and French versions of the Beaumont Agreement. 2 he'd already identified from his brief glance the night before. The other 3 were deeper, buried in the technical annexes and the performance milestone schedules, places where the French text created interpretive gaps that could cost Cole Financial millions in arbitration. Amelia watched him work without interrupting. When he put the pen down, she picked up the contract and read through his annotations slowly, her lips pressed together in a thin line. This is bad, she said finally. It's worse than bad. If this deal closes with these discrepancies intact, Beaumont has an exit ramp at every major milestone. They can trigger the force majeure clause anytime the market dips more than 8%, walk away clean, and keep the technology licensing rights because those are governed by the French text, not the English. Amelia put the contract down and rubbed her forehead. I raised concerns about the bilingual version last week. I told Vanessa's team we needed an independent French legal review. Do you know what happened? Let me guess. Richard Hale killed it. Amelia's eyes sharpened. How do you know about Richard Hale? I clean his office every night. His trash tells me more than he probably wants anyone to know. Ethan paused, choosing his next words carefully. 3 weeks ago, he threw away a draft email to someone at Beaumont's parent company. It was crumpled up, like he changed his mind about sending it. But I could read enough to see he was discussing deal terms that hadn't been approved by your executive team. Amelia went very still. You're telling me our chief operating officer is communicating directly with the other side. I'm telling you I saw a crumpled email in his trash. You can draw your own conclusions. What did the email say? Something about ensuring the French language version would govern in case of dispute, and a reference to a consulting fee. He didn't specify the amount, but the phrasing suggested it was personal, not corporate. Amelia stood up from her desk and walked to the window. 43 floors below, Michigan Avenue was still alive with headlights and cab drivers and the stubborn energy of a city that never fully surrendered to the dark. She stood there for a long time, her reflection ghosting against the glass. Do you have any idea what you've just walked into? She said without turning around. I have a pretty good idea, yeah. Richard Hale has been with this company for 19 years. He has relationships with every board member. He golfs with 3 of them. His wife runs the company's charitable foundation. If I walk into that conference room with a janitor's annotated contract and an accusation about back-channel communications, do you know what happens? Nothing good? Ethan said. Nothing good for you, nothing good for me, and probably nothing good for the truth. Amelia turned from the window. Vanessa trusts Richard. She brought him over from her father's firm when she took over. He's been her right hand since day one. Then we need more than my word. We need a lot more than your word. They looked at each other across the office, and something passed between them. Not trust exactly, because they'd known each other for approximately 1 hour, but something adjacent to it. Recognition, maybe. The acknowledgement that they were both standing on the same side of a line they hadn't asked to see. I can't protect you, Amelia said. If Richard finds out what you've told me, he'll have you fired within 24 hours. He'll make it look routine, budget cuts, restructuring, whatever. You'll be gone before anyone even notices. I know. You have a daughter. I know that too. Amelia sat back down. She picked up the annotated contract and looked at it again, and Ethan could see her doing the calculation. The risk versus the responsibility, the politics versus the math. In his experience, most people chose politics. It was safer. It was easier. It was the rational move for someone who'd spent 20 years building a career and didn't want to watch it burn because a janitor found something in a trash can. Okay, she said. Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to take your annotations and present them as my own analysis. I'll say I brought in an outside French legal consultant, someone off the books, someone Beaumont's team can't trace. You stay invisible. You keep cleaning floors and making coffee and doing whatever it is you do up here every night. Nobody knows your name. Nobody knows you exist. And Richard Hale? One problem at a time. She folded the contract and put it in her briefcase. Go back to work, Ethan, and for the love of everything, stop reading people's trash. Ethan went back to work. The next 3 days were the strangest of his life since Sarah died, which was saying something, because the year after Sarah died had included a lot of strange days, the kind where reality felt slightly off-center, like walking through a house where all the furniture had been moved 2 inches to the left. He cleaned floors. He pushed his cart. He made coffee. He did everything he was supposed to do, exactly the way he was supposed to do it, and he tried not to think about what was happening 42 floors above his pay grade. But Amelia texted him. She'd given him her personal number that first night, saved in his phone as AC, 43rd floor, and she sent short, careful messages at odd hours. Tuesday, 1:17 a.m. Presented analysis to Vanessa. She's skeptical but reviewing. Keep your head down. Wednesday, 6:45 p.m. Translation team confirmed 2 of 5 discrepancies. Vanessa ordered full independent review. Richard pushed back hard, said it would delay the timeline. Thursday, 2:33 a.m. Independent review found all 5. You were right about everything. Meeting tomorrow morning, don't come near 42. Ethan read that last message sitting in his car in the parking garage at the end of his shift. The Honda was cold and smelled like old coffee and the synthetic vanilla of the air freshener Chloe had picked out at the gas station. He stared at the screen until the words blurred, and then he put the phone down and drove to Mrs. Patterson's. He didn't feel triumphant. He didn't feel vindicated. He felt tired and scared and slightly nauseous, the way he always felt when the world demanded something from him that he wasn't sure he could deliver. Chloe was extra talkative at breakfast. She'd learned a new word at school, ecosystem, and she wanted to use it in every sentence. Daddy, is our apartment an ecosystem? In a way, yeah. Is Mrs. Patterson's kitchen an ecosystem? Definitely. There's at least 3 organisms living in that bread box. I heard that, Mrs. Patterson said from the stove. What about you, Daddy? Are you an ecosystem? Ethan looked at his daughter, 7 years old, gap-toothed, wearing a purple shirt with a dinosaur on it that she'd insisted on even though it was technically too small, and felt something crack open in his chest. Not break. Crack open, like a door that had been painted shut for years and was finally being forced by something stronger than the paint. I think everybody's kind of an ecosystem, he said. We've all got a lot of different things going on inside. The call came Thursday afternoon. Ethan was asleep on the couch, or trying to be, when his phone rang. Not a text this time, a call, from a number he didn't recognize. Mr. Brooks? This is Janet Foley, Executive Assistant to Vanessa Cole. Ms. Cole would like to see you in her office this evening at 8 p.m. before your shift begins. Ethan sat up on the couch. His heart was doing something uncomfortable against his ribs. Can I ask what this is about? Ms. Cole didn't specify. She asked me to tell you it's not optional. Okay. Her office is on 46, Suite 4600. You'll need to check in with security on the main floor. I'll leave your name at the desk. She hung up. Ethan sat on the couch for a long time, staring at the carpet, which had a stain near the coffee table from when Chloe had knocked over a glass of grape juice 2 months ago. He'd never gotten it out completely. Some things just stayed. He dropped Chloe at Mrs. Patterson's early that evening. He told her he had a meeting before work, which was technically true and sounded much less terrifying than what was actually happening. A meeting? Mrs. Patterson raised an eyebrow. With who? Nobody. Just building management stuff. She gave him a look that suggested she didn't believe him but wasn't going to push. She'd known him long enough to understand that Ethan Brooks shared information on his own schedule, which was usually somewhere between never and eventually. He drove to the Cole Financial Building and parked in the garage at 7:40 p.m. He was wearing his one good pair of khakis and a button-down shirt that he'd ironed on the kitchen counter because he didn't own an ironing board. The shirt was blue. Sarah had bought it for him years ago for a law school interview. He'd worn it maybe 3 times since. Security waved him through. The elevator to 46 required a special badge, which the guard provided with the disinterested efficiency of someone who'd been told to expect him. The ride-up took about 40 seconds and felt like 40 minutes. Suite 4600 was exactly what Ethan expected. The kind of office that communicated power through square footage rather than decoration. Large windows, minimal furniture, a desk the size of a small aircraft carrier. One wall had a bookshelf lined with legal texts and business books arranged by color, which told Ethan that someone other than Vanessa had organized them. Vanessa Cole was standing behind her desk when he walked in. She wasn't alone. Amelia Carter was sitting in one of the 2 chairs facing the desk, and she gave Ethan a look that was somewhere between encouragement and apology. And in the other chair, legs crossed, expression perfectly controlled, was Richard Hale. Richard Hale was 53 years old, a fact Ethan knew because the man's biography was on the company's website, and Ethan had looked it up after finding the crumpled email. He was the kind of executive who'd been born on third base and genuinely believed he'd hit a triple: good schools, family connections, a career trajectory that had more to do with who he knew than what he understood. He had a golfer's tan and a politician's smile, and the particular body language of a man who had never been seriously challenged in his professional life and didn't expect to start now. "Mr. Brooks," Vanessa said. She didn't invite him to sit down. "I understand you've been providing unsolicited analysis of our Beaumont contract." So much for staying invisible. Ethan glanced at Amelia, who gave a barely perceptible shake of her head. She hadn't betrayed him. Someone else had. "I noticed some discrepancies," Ethan said carefully. "Between the English and French versions, I mentioned them to Ms. Carter." "You mentioned them." Vanessa's voice was flat, controlled, the voice of someone who was very angry and very disciplined about it. "You're a janitor, Mr. Brooks. You empty trash cans and mop floors, and you're telling me you found critical errors in a 60-page bilingual contract that our legal team, our translation service, and our outside counsel all missed? I'm telling you the discrepancies exist. Your independent review confirmed them. I know what the review confirmed. What I don't know is how a night maintenance worker with no legal credentials became an expert in French commercial law." Richard Hale spoke for the first time. His voice was smooth, measured, the verbal equivalent of a freshly pressed suit. "If I may, Vanessa, I think the more important question is why this individual felt it was appropriate to insert himself into a confidential business transaction. This is a security concern. He had access to restricted documents. He communicated privileged information to a member of the executive team without authorization. For all we know, he could be working with Beaumont." Ethan felt something hot flash behind his eyes. Not anger exactly. Something more controlled than anger, but just as dangerous. The feeling of being underestimated by someone who didn't deserve to be in the same room. "I'm not working with Beaumont," he said. "I found the discrepancies because I can read French. I reported them because I didn't want to see this company get destroyed by a contract it didn't understand." "Noble," Richard said, leaning back in his chair with a half-smile that didn't reach his eyes. "And how exactly does a janitor learn to read French legal contracts?" "The same way anyone learns anything. I studied." "Where?" "That's not relevant." "I think it's very relevant. I think—" "Enough." Vanessa's voice cut through the room like a blade. She wasn't looking at Richard. She was looking at Ethan, and her expression had shifted. The anger was still there, but something else was competing with it. Something that looked, despite her best efforts, like curiosity. "Tomorrow morning," she said, "the Beaumont delegation arrives for the final negotiation. 3 days from now, this deal either closes or it collapses. I've spent 14 months on this agreement. My reputation, this company's future, everything is on the line." She paused. "Amelia tells me you identified 5 critical discrepancies. Our independent review confirmed all 5. That means my legal team missed them, my translation service missed them, and my COO." She glanced at Richard, and the glance was sharp enough to draw blood. "Apparently saw no need to request a bilingual audit despite being responsible for deal oversight." Richard's smile faded. "Vanessa, I explained that the timeline—" "I know what you explained, Richard. I also know what Mr. Brooks found. And right now, Mr. Brooks's analysis has been more useful than anything your team has produced in 14 months. The room went silent. Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Ethan could see the muscles working beneath the tan, the careful recalibration of a man who had just been publicly corrected and was already planning his response. Vanessa turned back to Ethan. "Here's what's going to happen. Tomorrow, I'm going to confront Beaumont's team about the discrepancies. I'm going to demand a unified contract where both language versions are identical, and I'm going to do it in a room full of lawyers who've spent their entire careers making sure that doesn't happen. I need someone who can verify the French text in real time. Not tomorrow, not after a review cycle. In the room, in the moment." Ethan stared at her. "You want me in the negotiation? I want someone who can read the French version as fast as they write it and tell me if they're trying to bury another trap. Amelia says that person is you. Is she right?" The question hung in the air between them, between the CEO in her corner office and the janitor in his ironed blue shirt, between the 46th floor and the basement locker room, between the person Ethan was and the person he used to be. "She's right," he said. "Then be here at 8 a.m. Wear something appropriate. And Mr. Brooks?" Vanessa's eyes locked onto his with an intensity that felt almost physical. "If you embarrass me in front of that delegation, I will end your career in this building. Every career. All of them. Are we clear?" "Crystal." He walked out of the office and took the elevator down alone. His hands were shaking, not from fear, or not entirely from fear, from something else. Something he hadn't felt in 3 years, something that had been locked in a box at the bottom of his chest next to Sarah's wedding ring and the letter from the law school and all the other artifacts of the life he'd buried. It felt terrifyingly like being alive. He sat in the Honda in the parking garage for 15 minutes before he could drive. The engine was off. The vanilla air freshener swayed gently from the rearview mirror. His phone buzzed once. Amelia. "I didn't tell her. Richard went through my emails, found our exchanges. I'm sorry." Ethan typed back, "It doesn't matter. I'm in the meeting tomorrow." 3 dots appeared. Then, "Be careful. Richard isn't done." He knew that. He could feel it the way you feel weather changing. A pressure shift, a drop in temperature, the sense that something was building behind the horizon that hadn't arrived yet, but was absolutely coming. He drove to Mrs. Patterson's. Chloe was already asleep. He stood in the doorway of the guest room and watched her breathe. In, out, the steady rhythm of a child who trusted the world to still be there when she woke up. Mr. Flopsy was tucked under her chin. Her library book about ocean animals was open on the nightstand, face down, spine cracked. Ethan leaned against the doorframe and thought about what he was about to do. Walk into a room full of people who were smarter than him, richer than him, more powerful than him, and stake everything: his job, his anonymity, his carefully constructed, invisible life, on the bet that he could still do the thing he'd once been good at. And then he thought about Chloe, asleep in someone else's bed because her father worked nights cleaning floors, and he thought about the field trip money and the broken vacuum wheel in the Honda that made a sound when he turned left, and he thought about the look on Richard Hale's face in Vanessa Cole's office. That smooth, practiced, effortless dismissal of a man who cleaned his trash can every single night. He went downstairs, told Mrs. Patterson he needed the morning off, and asked if she could take Chloe to school. "Of course, honey. Is everything okay?" "I don't know yet," he said, and for the first time in a long time, that was the honest answer. He drove home, hung the blue shirt on the back of the bathroom door, set his alarm for 6 a.m., and lay down on the couch. He didn't expect to sleep, but he did, almost immediately, dropping into the kind of deep, dreamless unconsciousness that comes when the body finally decides that tomorrow is too important for exhaustion. The alarm went off at 6. Ethan showered, dressed, and stood in front of the bathroom mirror for a long time. The man looking back at him was 32 years old, with tired eyes and a 2-day stubble he hadn't had time to shave properly, and a blue shirt that fit a little looser than it used to because he'd lost weight he couldn't afford to lose. He didn't look like a legal expert. He didn't look like someone who belonged on the 42nd floor of a financial corporation during business hours. He looked like a janitor wearing a nice shirt. He drove downtown, parked in the garage, walked through the lobby he'd mopped 100 times, and tried not to notice the security guards doing a double take. Rode the elevator to 42, checked in with the receptionist, who looked at his name on the visitor list and then looked at him and then looked at the list again. The conference room was already full. Beaumont's delegation had arrived, 5 people, led by a trim, gray-suited man Ethan recognized from his research as Philippe Beaumont himself, the founder's grandson and current CEO of Beaumont Group International. 2 lawyers flanked him, both French, both wearing the particular expression of people who expected to win and considered the meeting a formality. Vanessa was at the head of the table. Amelia was beside her. Mark, the silver-haired translator, was at the far end. Richard Hale was across from Vanessa, his posture relaxed, his face arranged in the expression of a man who had nothing to worry about. Every head in the room turned when Ethan walked in. He could feel their eyes cataloging him. The shirt, the khakis, the face they'd never seen in daylight. One of Beaumont's lawyers leaned over and whispered something to Philippe. Philippe's eyebrows rose slightly. Vanessa didn't introduce him. She gestured to an empty chair at the far end of the table, near the screen where the contract language was displayed, and Ethan sat down without a word. The meeting began. Philippe Beaumont opened with a compliment, which was how Ethan knew the man was dangerous. "Miss Cole, I want to begin by thanking you and your extraordinary team for accommodating this timeline. My grandfather always said that the best partnerships are forged under pressure." He smiled, the practiced continental smile of someone who'd been negotiating since before Ethan was born. His English was nearly flawless, with just enough French accent to remind everyone in the room that he came from money so old it had its own history books. "We are confident that today's session will bring us to a satisfying conclusion." Vanessa returned the smile without warmth. "I appreciate the sentiment, Philippe, but before we discuss conclusions, I'd like to address some concerns that have been raised about the contract language." "Of course." Philippe's expression didn't change, but Ethan noticed something, a micro-movement, barely visible. The man's left hand, which had been resting on the table, shifted half an inch toward the folder in front of him. A defensive gesture, unconscious. The kind of thing most people wouldn't catch. Ethan caught it because he'd spent 3 years watching people, not talking to them, not interacting with them, not being seen by them, just watching. And when you watch people long enough from the outside, you started to notice the things they didn't know they were doing. Vanessa pulled up Article 7 on the main screen. Both versions, English on the left, French on the right. Our review team has identified significant discrepancies between the English and French texts. Specifically, the indemnification cap language in the French version uses terminology that creates open-ended liability exposure for Cole Financial under French commercial law. Philippe turned to his lead attorney, a woman named Claire Marchand, who had the sharp, angular features and unreadable expression of someone who played chess for fun. Claire leaned forward. "Ms. Cole, with respect, the French and English versions of any bilingual contract will contain minor linguistic variations. This is standard practice. The legal intent is identical in both versions." "The legal intent may be identical," Vanessa said, "but the legal effect is not. And in my experience, when intent and effect diverge, it's the effect that shows up in court." Good line, Ethan thought. She'd probably rehearsed it. But it landed well, and he could see Philippe's other lawyer, a younger man who'd been introduced as Jean-Pierre something, shift uncomfortably in his seat. Perhaps we could address the specific language you find problematic, Philippe said, spreading his hands in a gesture of reasonableness. I'm certain this is simply a matter of translation nuance. I'd like that very much. Vanessa turned to Mark, who pulled up the French text of Article 7, Section 3. The words dans la limite des engagements cumulés were highlighted in yellow. Mark, could you read the highlighted passage and provide your translation? Mark cleared his throat. He was a good translator, said competent, thorough, reliable. But he wasn't a lawyer, and the gap between competent translation and legal interpretation was wide enough to drive a truck through. Within the limits of cumulative commitments, he said, essentially equivalent to the English phrasing capped at total contract value. Thank you, Mark. Vanessa looked at Ethan for the first time since the meeting started. Mr. Brooks? Every head turned. Ethan felt the weight of the room settle on him. 15 pairs of eyes, some curious, some hostile, most confused. The Beaumont team had no idea who he was. Richard Hale knew exactly who he was and was looking at him with an expression that could have curdled milk. Amelia was watching from across the table with the careful stillness of someone who had bet large on an uncertain outcome. Mark's translation is linguistically accurate, Ethan said. His voice was steady, which surprised him because his pulse was running at about twice its normal rate. But it misses the legal distinction. Engagements cumulés under French commercial code doesn't refer to the value of a single contract. It refers to the aggregate of all obligations, past, present, and future, between the two parties. Under the 2023 ruling in Leclerc Industries, French courts have interpreted this phrase to include implied future commitments that haven't been formally documented. The room went quiet. Not the polite quiet of people waiting for someone to finish speaking. The loaded quiet of people realizing that something they didn't expect was happening. Claire Marchand recovered first. I'm not aware of a Leclerc ruling that would apply to this context, and I'm curious about the qualifications of the gentleman providing this analysis. The ruling was issued by the Cour d'appel de Paris in March 2023, Ethan said. Société Beaumont, your parent company, incidentally, was the plaintiff. The court held that engagements cumulés could encompass obligations arising from commercial relationships that extended beyond the specific agreement in question. I'm happy to provide the case number if your team would like to review it. Claire's face didn't move, but her eyes did. A quick flick toward Philippe, so fast it was almost invisible. A check-in. A silent question. Did he know about this? Philippe knew about it. Ethan could tell from the way the man's posture changed. A subtle straightening, like a chess player who has just realized his opponent sees the board differently than expected. He didn't look surprised. He looked recalibrated. This is absurd, Richard Hale said. The words came out louder than they needed to, cutting through the tension like a car alarm at a funeral. Vanessa, I have to object to this entire exercise. You've brought a maintenance worker, a janitor, into a negotiation with one of the largest financial firms in Europe, and you're asking him to provide legal analysis? This is beyond inappropriate. It's embarrassing. Richard, Amelia started. No, I'm serious. Richard stood up, which was a power move Ethan recognized from every management seminar he'd never attended but had heard through conference room walls for 2 years. Standing made you taller. Standing made you the center of gravity. Standing said, I am the authority here. Philippe, I want to apologize on behalf of Cole Financial. This is not representative of how we conduct business. Mr. Brooks is a valued member of our facilities staff, but he has no role in these proceedings. Philippe raised one hand. Richard, please, I find this fascinating. He turned to Ethan with an expression of polite interest that was, Ethan suspected, about 90% performance. You mentioned the Leclerc ruling. You clearly have some background in French commercial law. May I ask where you studied? You may ask, but you won't answer. My background isn't what's being negotiated today. The contract language is. Philippe smiled, a real one this time. The involuntary smile of a man who had just encountered something genuinely unexpected. Fair enough. Then let me respond to your concern directly. The use of engagements cumulés in our draft was standard boilerplate from our legal team. Any resemblance to the Leclerc ruling is coincidental. With respect, Mr. Beaumont, I found 3 additional discrepancies between the English and French versions of this contract, all of which create advantageous interpretive positions for Beaumont Group under French jurisdiction. 1 coincidence is plausible, 5 is a strategy. The younger lawyer, Jean-Pierre, started to say something, but Claire put a hand on his arm. She was looking at Ethan the way a predator looks at another predator, not with hostility necessarily, but with the sharp, evaluative attention of someone who has identified a genuine threat. Could you identify these additional discrepancies? Claire said. Vanessa cut in. Mr. Brooks, proceed. Ethan walked them through it. The arbitration venue clause, how the French version specified Paris as default jurisdiction, while the English version left it open. The force majeure expansion, how perturbation économique significative created a unilateral exit option that didn't exist in the English text. The technology licensing annex, how a single word change in the French version, exclusive, became prioritaire, meaning prioritized rather than exclusive, would allow Beaumont to sub-license Cole Financial's proprietary algorithms to competitors. He spoke for 11 minutes. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't gesture. He stood at the end of the table in his blue shirt and khakis, and he laid out every trap that Beaumont's legal team had buried in the French text with the methodical precision of someone defusing a bomb. And when he was done, the silence in the room was so complete that Ethan could hear the ventilation system 2 floors above. Philippe Beaumont was no longer smiling. Claire Marchand was writing something on her legal pad without looking up. Richard Hale was staring at Ethan with an expression that had moved well past embarrassment into something darker and more personal. And Vanessa Cole was standing at the head of the table with her arms crossed, watching her entire deal rearrange itself in front of her, and Ethan couldn't tell if she wanted to thank him or fire him. I'd like to call a 30-minute recess, Philippe said. His voice was perfectly composed, but the temperature in it had dropped by several degrees. My team needs to consult on the points Mr. Brooks has raised. Take your time, Vanessa said. We'll be here. The Beaumont delegation left the conference room in a tight formation. Philippe first, then Claire, then Jean-Pierre, and the 2 silent associates who hadn't spoken a word during the entire session. The door closed behind them with a soft click that sounded in the quiet of the room like a period at the end of a sentence. Richard moved first. He crossed the room to where Vanessa was standing and lowered his voice, but not enough. Ethan could hear every word. This is a catastrophe. You've just accused our biggest potential partner of fraud, in their faces, using a janitor as your expert witness. Do you have any idea what this does to the relationship? I have a very clear idea of what it does, Richard. It prevents us from signing a contract that could have cost us hundreds of millions in liability. That's his interpretation. One man's interpretation based on a court ruling that may or may not be applicable. Our legal team reviewed this contract. They signed off on it. Our legal team didn't catch 5 discrepancies that a maintenance worker found in 40 minutes. Richard's voice dropped further. Vanessa, listen to me. I've been in this industry for almost 20 years. Deals like this don't come along every quarter. If we push Beaumont too hard, they walk. And if they walk, the board is going to want to know why, and the answer is going to be that you pulled a janitor into a boardroom and let him blow up a 14-month negotiation. The answer is going to be that our COO failed to order a bilingual legal audit that would have caught these issues months ago. Vanessa's voice was ice. That's the answer, Richard, and we both know it. Richard's face changed. The smooth, practiced confidence shifted, and for a moment, just a moment, something raw showed through. Not guilt, not shame, something more like the desperate calculation of a man who has just realized his margin of safety is narrower than he thought. I want him out of the next session, Richard said. No. Vanessa, I said no. He stays. And Richard, the next time you decide to override a risk assessment recommendation from a senior strategist, you'd better have a very good reason. Because right now, the only reason I can see is that a proper review would have caught these discrepancies before we got to this table, and you didn't want them caught. She walked away from him and toward the windows. Richard stood alone in the middle of the conference room with his hands at his sides and his jaw working silently. And Ethan watched him from the far end of the table and thought, he's going to come after me, Tonight, tomorrow, next week. It doesn't matter when. He's going to come after me, and when he does, it's going to be personal. Amelia appeared at Ethan's elbow. "Come with me," she said quietly. They walked to her office on 43. She closed the door and leaned against her desk with her arms crossed. "How are you doing?" "I'm terrified," Ethan said. "But other than that, fine." "You should be terrified. You just told a billionaire to his face that his legal team was trying to cheat us, and you did it in front of his own lawyers." "I told him the truth." "Same thing, in his world." Amelia uncrossed her arms and rubbed her eyes. She looked like she'd slept about 4 hours in the past 3 days, which was probably accurate. "Listen, Richard went through my email. That's how Vanessa found out about you. But what worries me more is what else Richard might be doing right now." "What do you mean?" "I mean, he's been in this company for 19 years. He has relationships everywhere: HR, legal, security, facilities. If he wants to make you disappear, he has the connections to do it. A bad performance review, a security flag, an anonymous complaint. There are 100 ways to destroy a contract employee, and none of them leave fingerprints." Ethan leaned against the wall. His back hurt. He'd been standing for 3 hours in shoes that were meant for office work, not for someone who spent most of his nights on his feet pushing a cleaning cart. "What do you think I should do?" "I think you should be very careful, and I think you should document everything, every conversation, every email, every text. If Richard moves against you, you're going to need a paper trail." "I'm a janitor, Amelia. Nobody's going to take my paper trail seriously against a COO. They will if the CEO is already asking questions about how her COO missed 5 contract discrepancies that her janitor found in less than an hour." Ethan looked at her. She was smart, genuinely smart, not the corporate strategy buzzword kind of smart, but the kind that involved seeing systems and understanding how people moved within them. She reminded him, in a way that hurt, of his constitutional law professor at school, the one who'd written him a recommendation letter that called him the most naturally gifted legal mind I've encountered in 15 years of teaching. The letter was still in a drawer in his apartment, underneath his socks. He hadn't read it in years, but he couldn't throw it away. "Why are you helping me?" he asked. Amelia was quiet for a moment. "Because I've been in this building for 7 years, and in 7 years, I've watched 3 deals go bad because nobody had the guts to say what was wrong. Good people lost their jobs. People like you, maintenance staff, admin assistants, cafeteria workers, the ones who always get cut first." She paused. "And because you're right, about the contract, about Richard, about all of it, and being right should count for something, even when you're wearing coveralls." A knock on the door. Janet Foley, Vanessa's executive assistant, leaned in. "They're back. Ms. Cole wants everyone in 42A, now." The walk from 43 to 42 took 90 seconds. In those 90 seconds, Ethan thought about Chloe at school, probably in her 2nd grade classroom right now, learning about ecosystems or multiplication tables or whatever 7-year-olds learned on Thursday mornings. He thought about Mrs. Patterson standing at the bus stop with her, holding her hand, doing the job that Ethan couldn't do because he was here, in this building, doing a different job that nobody had asked him to do, and everybody was mad at him for doing. He thought about Sarah. Not the hospital version of Sarah, not the thin, tired, fading version that haunted his worst nights. The real Sarah. The one who used to sit cross-legged on their apartment floor with her notes spread around her, quizzing Ethan on contract law while eating takeout Chinese food straight from the container. The one who had looked at him one night, chopsticks in hand, and said, "You're going to be the best attorney in Chicago someday. You know that, right?" He hadn't been able to answer her then. He couldn't answer her now. Conference room 42. 42. A was charged when he walked back in. The Beaumont delegation had returned, but the dynamic had shifted. Philippe was no longer at ease. Claire Marchand had a laptop open in front of her that hadn't been there before. The younger lawyer, Jean-Pierre, was whispering rapidly to one of the associates. Vanessa was already seated. Richard was in his chair, but his posture had changed. He was leaning forward now, hands flat on the table, the body language of someone bracing for impact. Philippe spoke first. "Ms. Cole, my team has reviewed the points raised by your consultant." The pause before consultant was deliberate, a polite refusal to acknowledge what Ethan actually was. We acknowledge that certain linguistic variations exist between the two language versions of the contract. However, we believe these are matters of interpretation, not intent. Then you won't mind revising the French text to match the English version exactly, Vanessa said. That would require significant redrafting. The timeline is whatever I say it is, Philippe. This is my deal, my terms. If the French version matches the English version, we close Friday as planned. If it doesn't, there is no deal. Philippe looked at Claire. Claire looked at her laptop. Something passed between them. A communication that didn't require words, the kind of shorthand that develops between people who have worked together long enough to think in parallel. We would need to review the specific passages in question, Claire said, with the assistance of your consultant if he's available. He's available, Vanessa said, and gestured toward Ethan. What followed was the most intense 2 hours of Ethan's life since the night Sarah died. He sat at the table across from Claire Marchand, and they went through the contract line by line, clause by clause, word by word. She was brilliant. No question about that. She argued in French and English with equal precision, and she fought for every comma, every preposition, every article. She challenged Ethan's interpretation of engagements cumules with 3 counterexamples from French case law. She cited a European Court of Justice ruling that she claimed superseded the Leclerc decision. She was fast, she was thorough, and she was used to winning. But Ethan was faster. Not because he was smarter than Claire Marchand. He wasn't sure he was. But because he'd spent 3 years in silence, 3 years reading everything he could get his hands on during the dead hours between midnight and 6 a.m., 3 years keeping his mind alive while his body pushed a cart through marble hallways. He knew the case law not because he'd studied it for a specific purpose, but because he'd studied it the way a drowning man breathes. Desperately. Instinctively. Because stopping would mean something worse than the effort. He countered every argument. He caught a new discrepancy in the performance schedules that he'd missed in his first review. A subtle difference in how satisfactory completion was defined in French versus English that could have given Beaumont unilateral authority to declare any milestone incomplete. Claire conceded the point with a tight nod that cost her visibly. By hour 2, the conference room had divided into 2 conversations. Ethan and Claire at one end of the table, rewriting contract language in real time, and everyone else at the other end, watching in the stunned silence of people who had come to a chess match and accidentally walked into a boxing ring. Richard Hale hadn't spoken in over an hour. He was sitting in his chair with his phone under the table, texting someone. Ethan noticed but said nothing. There was nothing to say yet. Richard would make his move. The only question was when. At 12:30, Vanessa called for lunch. The Beaumont team retreated to a private conference room down the hall. Cole Financial's team scattered. Some to their offices, some to the executive dining room, some just to stand in the hallway and breathe. Ethan went to the restroom. He stood at the sink and ran cold water over his wrists and looked at himself in the mirror. His face was flushed. His hands were steady, but only because he was concentrating on keeping them steady. His shirt had come untucked on one side, and there was a coffee stain on his right cuff, a small, dark spot that he hadn't noticed until now. He laughed, quietly, to himself, alone in a bathroom that he'd cleaned 100 times. He'd found a coffee stain on Vanessa Cole's sleeve the first night. Now he had one on his own. Some kind of symmetry in that, though he wasn't sure what it meant. His phone buzzed. Mrs. Patterson. Chloe's teacher called. She wants to know if you can chaperone the field trip next Friday. Ethan stared at the message. Next Friday. A week from now. In a week, he might not have a job. He might not have a reference. He might be back to scanning help-wanted ads and doing the math between rent and groceries and wondering if the Honda would survive another winter. He typed back, "Tell her I'll try." Then he washed his face, tucked in his shirt, and walked back to the conference room because the afternoon session was about to start, and Claire Marchand was going to come out fighting, and he needed to be ready. Vanessa caught him in the hallway. She was holding a fresh cup of coffee, and her expression was different from what he'd seen before. Still guarded, still controlled, but with something underneath that she wasn't quite managing to hide. "Brooks?" "Ms. Cole." She looked at him for a long moment. Not the dismissive scan from the first night, something more considered. Where did you go to law school? I didn't finish. That's not what I asked. He hesitated. Northwestern, 2 years. Why did you leave? The answer sat in his throat like a stone. He could feel the weight of it. The hospitals, the bills, the letters, the funeral, the apartment in Humboldt Park, and the couch where he slept, and the gap-toothed smile of a little girl who deserved a better life than the one he was barely holding together. Because life happened, he said, and it didn't ask permission. Vanessa looked at him a moment longer, and something in her expression shifted. A crack in the armor, hairline thin but real. Then she nodded once, turned, and walked back into the conference room. Ethan followed her. The afternoon session was about to begin, and somewhere on the other side of that table, Claire Marchand was sharpening her next argument, and Richard Hale was typing on his phone beneath the table, and the clock was ticking toward Friday, and nothing, absolutely nothing, was settled yet. The afternoon session started at 1:15 p.m., and Vanessa Cole did something nobody expected. She handed the floor to Ethan. Not formally. She didn't introduce him with a title or a credential. She simply opened the revised contract document on the main screen, turned to the Beaumont delegation, and said, Mr. Brooks will walk both teams through the proposed unified language for each disputed clause. Any objections from either side will be addressed in real time. Philippe Beaumont raised an eyebrow, but didn't object. Claire Marchand opened her laptop and positioned her fingers over the keyboard like a pianist settling before a difficult piece. Richard Hale sat rigid in his chair with his arms crossed, his face arranged in an expression of professional neutrality that didn't quite cover the fury underneath. Ethan stood up. He'd never stood at the head of a conference table before. In law school, he'd done moot court exercises in small classrooms with folding tables and fluorescent lighting. This was different. This was Italian marble and curved glass and a view of Lake Michigan that made the room feel like it was floating above the city. The table was 20 feet long, polished to a mirror finish, and lined with people who collectively controlled more money than Ethan would earn in 10 lifetimes. His mouth was dry, his palms were wet. The coffee stain on his cuff was still there, a small brown reminder that he didn't belong here, had never belonged here, was operating on borrowed time in a borrowed room wearing a shirt his dead wife had bought him. He started talking anyway. Article 7, Section 3, Indemnification. He pulled up the side-by-side text. The current French version reads Dans la limite des engagements cumulés. The proposed revision replaces this with Dans la limite de la valeur totale du contrat, which mirrors the English capped at total contract value without interpretive ambiguity. Ms. Marchand, does Beaumont Group accept this revision? Claire looked at Philippe. Philippe gave an almost imperceptible nod. Accepted, Claire said, with the caveat that we reserve the right to revisit if subsequent clauses create internal inconsistency. Noted. Ethan moved to the next clause, Article 12, Section 1, Arbitration Venue. They worked through it, clause by clause, line by line, the way two surgeons might operate on the same patient, carefully, precisely, with full awareness that one wrong move could kill the thing they were both trying to save. Claire fought hard on the arbitration clause, arguing for Paris as the default venue. Ethan countered with a proposal for neutral arbitration in Geneva under ICC rules, which gave neither party home jurisdiction. Claire countered with The Hague. Ethan suggested language that allowed for rotating venues based on the nature of the dispute. They went back and forth for 40 minutes on that single clause. At one point, Felipe leaned over to his associate and murmured something in French that he clearly assumed nobody on Cole Financial's side would understand. This man thinks like a lawyer, not a janitor. Find out who he is. Ethan heard it. He didn't react. He kept his eyes on the contract and his voice level and pretended that his heart wasn't hammering against his ribs like a fist against a locked door. By 3 o'clock, they'd resolved 3 of the 5 discrepancies. The arbitration venue was settled. Geneva, ICC rules, rotating panel. The force majeure language was tightened to match the English version exactly. The technology licensing annex was rewritten to restore exclusive rights in both language versions. 2 clauses remained, the indemnification cap and the performance milestone definitions. That's when Vanessa decided to test him. She didn't announce it, she didn't signal it. She simply asked Claire to draft a new clause, A compromise on the performance milestones that would satisfy both parties. Claire typed for several minutes, projected the French text onto the screen, and Vanessa turned to Ethan. "Mr. Brooks, read it." Ethan read it. The clause was complex. 3 nested conditions governing milestone completion, with cross-references to 2 other sections of the agreement. Claire had written it quickly, under pressure, and Ethan could see the craftsmanship in it. She was good. Every word was deliberate, every phrase balanced against its counterpart in the broader agreement. But something was wrong. He read it again. The room was silent. Everyone was watching him, the Beaumont team, the Cole financial team, Amelia with her pen frozen over her notepad, Richard with his arms still crossed and his jaw still tight. Ethan stopped reading. The silence stretched. 5 seconds. 10. He could feel the tension building in the room, the unspoken question forming on every face. Has he hit his limit? Is this where the janitor finally runs out of road? He wasn't frozen because he was confused. He was frozen because he'd found something, and the thing he'd found was so unexpected that he needed a moment to process the implications. "Mr. Brooks?" Vanessa's voice carried a warning. "Is there a problem?" "Yes," Ethan said slowly, "but not the problem you think." He turned to the screen and pointed to the 3rd line of Claire's new clause. This sentence, "sous réserve de conformité aux critères qualitatifs définis à l'annexe C12, is structurally correct. But critères qualitatifs is ambiguous in this context. Under French contract law, qualitative criteria can be subjectively assessed, which means Beaumont's team could unilaterally determine whether a milestone has been met based on their own quality standards, without independent verification. Claire's typing stopped. She looked at Ethan with narrowed eyes. "That was not my intention." "I believe you. But the language allows for that interpretation, and in arbitration, interpretation is what matters." "Then what do you suggest?" Ethan thought for a moment. He could feel the room leaning toward him. Not physically, but attentionally, the way an audience leans toward a stage when something important is about to happen. Replace critères qualitatifs with critères objectivement vérifiables, objectively verifiable criteria. It closes the interpretive gap and aligns with the English version's language about independent verification. Claire stared at him. Then she looked at Philippe. Then she looked back at the screen and made the change without speaking. But that wasn't the part that had made Ethan stop. He'd stopped because while reading Claire's new clause, he'd followed the cross-reference to Annex C2, which was displayed in a smaller window at the bottom of the screen. And in Annex C2, he'd seen something that changed everything. A reference to a side agreement. A protocole d'accord complémentaire, a supplementary memorandum of understanding, dated 6 weeks ago and signed by 2 parties. The first party was Beaumont Group International. The second party was identified only by initials, R.H. Richard Hale. Ethan's brain worked through it in about 3 seconds. A side agreement between Beaumont and Richard Hale, executed 6 weeks before the final negotiation, referenced in the technical annexes of the French contract, but not in the English version. Which meant Richard hadn't just failed to order a bilingual audit. He'd actively participated in creating the discrepancies. He'd been working with Beaumont behind Cole Financial's back, and the side agreement was the proof. The crumpled email in Richard's trash. The resistance to independent review. The aggressive push to close the deal without proper legal oversight. It all connected. Not like a conspiracy theory, where you had to squint and stretch and assume the worst about people. Like an accounting ledger, where every number pointed to the same bottom line. Ethan looked at Richard across the table. Richard was looking at his phone, thumbs moving, apparently unaware that the technical annex on the screen contained the thread that would unravel his entire career. Ethan looked at Amelia. She was reading the screen too, and from the way her face had gone very still, she'd seen it. He looked at Vanessa. She was watching Claire make the revision and hadn't noticed the annex reference. He had a choice. He could say something now. In front of Philippe, in front of the entire Beaumont delegation, in front of Richard himself. He could blow the whole thing open and let the pieces fall wherever they fell. It would be dramatic. It would be satisfying. And it would probably destroy the deal entirely, because Philippe Beaumont would walk away from a negotiation that had devolved into an internal corruption scandal and Vanessa Cole would be left with nothing except a very public humiliation. Or he could wait. Tell Amelia. Tell Vanessa privately. Let them handle Richard on their own terms after the deal was secured. He chose to wait. Not because it was easier. It wasn't. It was actually physically painful to sit there and watch Richard Hale text under the table while a reference to his betrayal glowed on the screen 12 feet away. But because blowing it up now would hurt the people who didn't deserve to be hurt. The employees. The invisible ones. The janitors and cafeteria workers and security guards whose jobs depended on this deal going through. He caught Amelia's eye and gave a small shake of his head. Not now. She held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded. The session continued. By 5 o'clock, all 5 discrepancies had been resolved. Both language versions of the contract were identical in every material respect. Claire Marchand signed off on the revisions with the gracious efficiency of someone who knew how to lose a battle without surrendering the war. Philippe Beaumont stood, buttoned his jacket, and extended his hand to Vanessa. I believe we have a deal, Ms. Cole. Subject to final review by both legal teams, I'm prepared to sign tomorrow. Tomorrow, Vanessa confirmed. They shook hands. It was brief, firm, and carried the particular energy of 2 people who respected each other just enough to do business and not a fraction more. The Beaumont delegation left. The conference room emptied. Ethan sat in his chair and stared at the table and felt something drain out of him. Adrenaline, probably, or whatever chemical cocktail his body had been running on for the past 6 hours. He felt hollow, scraped out, like someone had reached inside his chest and removed the engine that had been keeping him upright. Amelia found him there 5 minutes later. You saw it, she said, closing the door behind her. The side agreement. I saw it. R.H. Richard Hale. Yeah. Amelia sat down across from him. She looked as exhausted as he felt, gray under the eyes, her hair escaping from its clip, her blazer wrinkled from a day spent in a chair watching 2 people rewrite a 60-page contract in real time. We need to tell Vanessa, she said. I know, but not tonight. She needs to close this deal first. If she confronts Richard before the signing, he'll sabotage it. He'll call Philippe. He'll claim the contract was revised under duress. He'll find a way to blow it up because that's the only play he has left. Amelia considered this. And after the signing? After the signing, the deal is locked. The unified contract is binding. Richard's side agreement becomes evidence of fraud, not leverage. He can't unwind the deal without admitting his own involvement. So we wait. We wait until tomorrow afternoon, after the signatures are dry. Then we give Vanessa everything. The side agreement reference, the crumpled email, the timeline of how Richard blocked the bilingual review. She can decide what to do with it. Amelia leaned back and let out a long breath. You know, for a janitor, you think like a very good lawyer. For a senior strategist, you trust people way too easily. She almost laughed. It was the first time Ethan had seen anything close to humor on her face in 4 days. I trusted you. Like I said. She shook her head. Go home, Ethan. See your daughter. Get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. He drove to Mrs. Patterson's in the fading light. Rush hour traffic on the Kennedy was its usual catastrophe. A slow-motion parade of brake lights and frustration that stretched from downtown to the Humboldt Park exit like a 20-mile parking lot. Ethan sat in the Honda with the window cracked and the radio tuned to a jazz station that played the kind of music nobody listened to on purpose, but everybody recognized. His body was in the car. His mind was still in the conference room, still looking at the screen, still reading those initials, RH, and thinking about what they meant. Richard Hale was not a stupid man. He was lazy, maybe. Entitled, definitely. The kind of executive who confused tenure with talent and relationships with results. But he wasn't stupid enough to put his initials on a side agreement and leave a reference to it in the contract he was trying to push through his own company. Which meant one of 2 things. Either he didn't know the reference was there, Claire Marchand had included it, without telling him, as insurance, as leverage, as a way to protect Beaumont if the deal went sideways. Or he knew it was there and didn't care, because he was so confident that nobody on Cole Financial's side would ever read the French annexes closely enough to find it. Both possibilities made Ethan's stomach turn. The first meant Claire was even more dangerous than he'd thought, The second meant Richard had underestimated everyone around him so thoroughly that he'd gotten careless, and careless people with power were the most dangerous kind. He picked up Chloe at 6:30. She was drawing at Mrs. Patterson's kitchen table. A picture of a fish with legs, which she explained was a land fish that had decided to try living on the ground. "Does the land fish like it on the ground?" Ethan asked, carrying her to the car. "Not really. The ground is hard and there's no water, but she's brave, so she keeps trying." "That's a good story." "It's not a story, Daddy. It's science." Mrs. Patterson said evolution is when animals try new things, and sometimes it works. Ethan buckled her into the car seat and stood there for a moment with his hand on the door frame, looking at his daughter, 7 years old, gap-toothed, fierce in the specific way that children are fierce, without knowing that the world would eventually try to teach her not to be. "Daddy, why are you wearing your nice shirt?" "I had a meeting today." "At the building where you clean?" "Yeah." "Was it a good meeting?" He thought about it. He thought about Claire Marchand and her laptop, and the way she'd conceded points with the tight precision of someone who knew exactly how much ground she could afford to lose. He thought about Philippe Beaumont's murmured French. "This man thinks like a lawyer, not a janitor," and the strange, complicated feeling that sentence had produced in his chest. He thought about Vanessa Cole's question in the hallway. "Why did you leave?" And the answer he'd given, and the 100 other answers he hadn't. "I think it was," he said. "Yeah, I think it was a good meeting." He made Chloe dinner, spaghetti with jarred sauce because that's what they had, and a side of carrots that she ate under protest. And then he read her a chapter from her Ocean Animals book and tucked her into bed with Mr. Flopsy and kissed her forehead and stood in the doorway listening to her breathe. His phone buzzed. Amelia. Richard just sent an email to the full executive team. Subject line, "Concerns about procedural irregularities in Beaumont negotiation." He's trying to discredit the revised contract, says it was modified without proper legal review, and that an unqualified individual was given inappropriate access to confidential documents. Ethan read the message twice. Then he typed back, "Is Vanessa on the distribution list?" "Yes." What did she reply? Nothing yet. Ethan put his phone down on the kitchen counter and stood in the middle of his apartment, the small, tired apartment with the grape juice stain on the carpet, and the couch where he slept, and the kitchen where he cooked spaghetti with jarred sauce for his daughter. And he thought about Richard Hale sitting in some house in Lincoln Park, or Lakeview, or wherever COOs lived, typing his email, marshaling his allies, positioning his defense. Richard was fighting for his career, for his reputation, for the comfortable, insulated life he'd built over 19 years of corporate politics and golf games and handshake agreements that existed in the space between what was legal and what was right. Ethan was fighting for a $12.50 an hour cleaning job and a daughter who drew pictures of brave fish. It wasn't fair. But Ethan had stopped expecting fair a long time ago. Fair was a concept that belonged to people who'd never sat in a hospital room watching the numbers go wrong, who'd never carried a sleeping child down 3 flights of stairs because the elevator was broken again, who'd never done math at the grocery store to figure out if they could afford both milk and eggs in the same week. He wasn't playing for fair. He was playing for something smaller and more important than that. He was playing for tomorrow, for the next day, for the next field trip, the next pair of shoes, the next chapter of the Ocean Animals book. He was playing for the look on Chloe's face when she showed him the landfish drawing and said, "She's brave, so she keeps trying," because that fish was Chloe, and that fish was Ethan, and that fish was every person who had ever decided to try living on the ground, even though the ground was hard and there was no water. He set his alarm for 6. He laid out his blue shirt, Sarah's shirt, on the back of the bathroom door. He lay down on the couch and pulled the blanket up and closed his eyes. Tomorrow, Philippe Beaumont would sign the corrected contract. Tomorrow, the deal would close. Tomorrow, Ethan would tell Vanessa Cole about the side agreement, about the initials, about the trail of evidence that led from a crumpled email in a trash can to a 53-year-old man in a corner office who had sold out his own company for a consulting fee he thought nobody would ever find. And then, whatever happened next, whatever Richard did, whatever Vanessa decided, whatever the board voted, whatever the world threw at him, Ethan would go back to Mrs. Patterson's apartment and pick up his daughter and take her home and make her dinner and read her a book and stand in her doorway and listen to her breathe. Because that was the deal. That was always the deal. Take care of Chloe. Keep pushing. Don't stop. The vacuum wheel could scream all it wanted. He was still moving. The signing happened at 10 a.m. on Friday morning in the same conference room where everything had started. 42A, with the curved glass wall and the view of the lake and the 20-foot table polished to a mirror finish. Philippe Beaumont signed first, then Vanessa Cole, and the room applauded in the restrained way that corporate people applaud. Brief, measured, appropriate. Champagne appeared. Hands were shaken. Photographs were taken for the press release that would go out by noon. Ethan wasn't in the room. He was sitting in Amelia Carter's office on 43, wearing his blue shirt for the third straight day because it was the only good shirt he owned, drinking coffee that tasted significantly better than anything Mrs. Patterson brewed, but that he would never admit was better because Mrs. Patterson's coffee came with pancakes and kindness, and those things had no price equivalent. Amelia came in at 10:22. She closed the door and leaned against it. "It's done," she said. "Signed, sealed, filed. The unified contract governs in both jurisdictions. Everything Beaumont's team tried to bury is gone." "Good. Now for the hard part. Richard." "Richard?" Amelia sat down at her desk and opened her laptop. She'd spent the previous night building a file, every piece of evidence they had, organized chronologically. The crumpled email from Richard's trash. The Annex C2 reference to the side agreement with the RH initials. Richard's email to the executive team attempting to discredit the revised contract. The timeline showing how Richard had blocked the bilingual review at 3 separate decision points over the past 6 months. "I requested a meeting with Vanessa at 11, Amelia said. "Just the 3 of us." She agreed. Ethan put down his coffee. "She doesn't know what it's about?" "She knows it's about Richard. I told her we had information that required her immediate attention. She didn't ask questions." "She already suspects." "She's not stupid, Ethan. She's been watching Richard since you walked into that boardroom. She may not know the specifics, but she knows something is wrong. She's known for a while, probably longer than either of us." Ethan thought about that. About Vanessa Cole standing at the head of the table, watching her COO undermine her deal from the inside, and choosing to keep him close enough to see rather than far enough to ignore. That wasn't trust. That was strategy. The same kind of strategy Ethan had used when he decided not to expose the side agreement during the negotiation. Hold the information, wait for the right moment, let the other person make their move before you make yours. Vanessa Cole was not a warm person. She was not an easy person. She was not the kind of person Ethan would choose to have dinner with or ask for advice or sit next to on a long flight. But she was smart in a way that he recognized, because it was the same kind of smart he'd spent 3 years pretending not to be. The kind that saw patterns where other people saw noise, that heard the thing behind the thing, that understood that the most important word in any sentence was usually the one nobody said. They went to Vanessa's office at 11. She was standing behind her desk, the same position she'd been in the first time Ethan had walked into Suite 4600, and the parallel was not lost on him. Same room, same woman, different conversation. "Close the door," Vanessa said. Amelia closed it. Ethan sat down in the same chair he'd sat in 3 days ago when Richard Hale had been sitting next to him and the world had been a slightly simpler place. "Tell me," Vanessa said. She didn't sit down. She didn't qualify the request. Just those 2 words, flat and direct, the way a surgeon might say scalpel. Amelia told her. She walked through the evidence methodically. The side agreement, the initials, the crumpled email, the pattern of obstruction. She was thorough without being dramatic, precise without being cold. She presented facts the way a good strategist does, in order, with context, without editorializing. Vanessa listened without interrupting. She stood behind her desk with her hands at her sides and her face very still, and Ethan watched her absorb each piece of information the way a structure absorbs weight, incrementally, internally, with no visible sign of strain until the moment the load exceeds capacity. When Amelia finished, Vanessa was quiet for a long time. 30 seconds. A minute. Long enough for the silence to become its own kind of sound. the sound of someone rearranging everything they thought they knew. "How long?" she said finally. Not a question, a demand. "Based on the dating of the side agreement, at least 6 weeks," Amelia said. "Possibly longer. The pattern of blocking the bilingual review goes back 6 months." 6 months. Vanessa's voice didn't change, but her hands curled into fists at her sides. Not rage. Something more controlled than rage. The physical expression of a person who has just learned that someone she trusted has been operating against her for half a year and she didn't catch it. "He sat in this office 3 days ago and told me the janitor was a security risk. He looked me in the face and said that. He did. While he was the one communicating with Beaumont behind my back. While he was the one who had a financial arrangement with the other side of my deal." She paused. "What was the arrangement? What did he get?" "We don't have the full terms," Amelia said. "The side agreement is referenced in the annex but not reproduced. Based on the crumpled email, it appears to involve a consulting fee. Personal, not corporate. We'd need to subpoena the full document from Beaumont or from Richard's personal records. I'll get a subpoena by Monday." Vanessa turned to the window. The lake was gray today, overcast, the kind of Chicago sky that looked like it couldn't decide between rain and resignation. "Mr. Brooks?" "Yes, ma'am." "You found the email in his trash?" "Yes." 3 weeks ago. About that. Why didn't you come to me immediately?" Ethan thought about it. He could give her the diplomatic answer, the one about wanting to verify the information, about not wanting to make accusations without evidence, about following proper channels. But Vanessa Cole didn't seem like someone who appreciated diplomatic answers. "Because I'm a janitor," he said, "and you're the CEO. And 3 weeks ago, if I'd walked into your office and told you that your COO was working with the other side, you would have had security escort me out of the building." Vanessa turned from the window and looked at him. Her expression was hard to read. Frustration, maybe, or the uncomfortable recognition of a truth she didn't want to acknowledge. "You're probably right," she said. "I probably would have." "I know." Another silence. Vanessa sat down for the first time, sank into her chair, really, with the sudden heaviness of someone who has been carrying something invisible for too long and has finally set it down. "I brought Richard in from my father's firm," she said. "Not to Ethan exactly, and not to Amelia, to the room, to the air, to nobody. When I took over this company, I was 27 years old. Every board member, every executive, every analyst on Wall Street was waiting for me to fail. Richard was the one person I thought I could trust. He'd worked with my father for 15 years. He knew the business. He knew the people." She paused. "I built my entire leadership structure around him. Every major decision for the past 3 years has gone through his office." "Vanessa," Amelia said gently, "this isn't your fault." "I know it's not my fault, but it is my problem." Vanessa straightened in her chair, and the vulnerability that had cracked through her composure closed back up like a door swinging shut. "Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to call an emergency board meeting for Monday morning. I'm going to present the evidence. I'm going to request Richard's immediate termination and a full forensic audit of every deal he's touched in the past 3 years. Legal will handle the subpoena." "And if Richard tries to get ahead of it?" Amelia asked. "His email to the executive team was a preemptive strike. He's already laying the groundwork to frame this as a procedural dispute. Let him. His email accused an unqualified individual of accessing confidential documents. That unqualified individual just saved this company from signing a contract that could have cost us $200 million in uncapped liability. The board can do the math." But Vanessa looked at Ethan. "Mr. Brooks, I owe you an apology." Ethan blinked. Of all the things he'd expected to hear in this office, that was somewhere near the bottom of the list. "The first night we met," Vanessa said, "I asked you to refill soap dispensers and make coffee. I didn't look at you. I didn't think about you. You were the cleaning staff. You were part of the building, like the elevator or the ventilation system, functional, invisible." She paused. "I'm not going to pretend that was okay. It wasn't. And the fact that it took you saving my company for me to see you as a person, that says more about me than it does about you." Ethan didn't know how to respond to that. He sat in the chair in his wrinkled blue shirt with the coffee stain on the cuff and looked at the most powerful woman in the building and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not gratitude exactly, and not vindication. Something closer to being seen, actually seen. Not as a janitor or a legal mind or a widower or a single father or any of the other labels he'd collected over the past 3 years, but as a person. Whole, complicated, real. "Thank you," he said. It was inadequate, but it was honest. "Don't thank me yet." Vanessa opened a folder on her desk. "I want to offer you a position. Senior International Contract Advisor, reporting directly to me. Full salary, full benefits, relocation assistance if you want it. You'd be responsible for reviewing every bilingual contract that comes through this office before it reaches my desk." The number she named was more than Ethan made in a year. In a year and a half, actually, if he was counting overtime. He stared at her. "I don't have a law degree. I'm not hiring a lawyer. I'm hiring someone who can read a French contract faster and more accurately than any lawyer I've ever worked with. The degree is a formality. Your work this week is the credential." "I'd want to finish my education," Ethan said, and the words came out before he'd fully decided to say them. "Eventually, part-time, nights, whatever it takes. Not because I need the paper, because I started something and I want to finish it. We have a tuition reimbursement program, full ride for employees in good standing. Talk to HR." Vanessa closed the folder. "Do you need time to think about it?" Ethan thought about it right there, in the chair, in real time. He thought about the night shift and the vacuum wheel and the $12.50 an hour wage that covered rent and groceries and not much else. He thought about Chloe sleeping in Mrs. Patterson's guest bed 5 nights a week because her father worked nights. He thought about the field trip money and the Honda that made a sound when he turned left and the couch where he slept because Chloe had the bedroom and that was how it should be. He thought about Sarah, not the hospital version, the real version, cross-legged on the floor, chopsticks in hand, looking at him with the absolute certainty of someone who saw the best version of him and refused to accept anything less. "You're going to be the best attorney in Chicago someday. You know that, right?" He wasn't going to be the best attorney in Chicago. He wasn't going to be an attorney at all. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But he was going to be something he hadn't been in 3 years. He was going to be visible. "I don't need time," he said. "I'm in." The Monday board meeting lasted 4 hours. Ethan wasn't present. It was above his clearance, even with the new title. But Amelia texted him updates throughout the morning. Richard Hale arrived in his best suit with a prepared statement and a lawyer of his own. He denied everything for the first 90 minutes. Then Vanessa produced the Annex C2 reference, and the forensic team presented preliminary findings from Richard's corporate email archive showing 17 separate communications with Beaumont's parent company over the past 8 months, including discussion of the side agreement's financial terms. Richard's lawyer asked for a recess. When they came back, Richard resigned. No severance, no reference letter, a non-disclosure agreement that prevented him from discussing the details, and a quiet exit through the parking garage rather than the lobby. Amelia's final text came at 2:47 p.m. "It's over. He's gone." Ethan read the message in Mrs. Patterson's kitchen, where he was sitting with Chloe while she worked on her homework. A worksheet about animal habitats that she was completing with aggressive enthusiasm and questionable spelling. "Daddy, how do you spell ocean? O-C-E-A-N. That doesn't seem right. It's one of those words that doesn't look like it sounds." English is weird." "Yeah, it kind of is." He told Mrs. Patterson that night. He sat at her kitchen table after Chloe was asleep and explained everything. Not all the details, not the contract language or the side agreement or the French case law, but the shape of it, the offer, the salary, the change. Mrs. Patterson listened without interrupting, the way she always did, with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea and her eyes steady and warm. "So you won't be working nights anymore," she said when he finished. "No, regular hours, 9 to 5, more or less. And Chloe? I'll drop her at school in the morning and pick her up in the afternoon, like a normal parent." The word felt strange in his mouth. Normal. He'd spent so long in the margins that normal sounded exotic. Mrs. Patterson reached across the table and put her hand over his. Her skin was papery and warm, The skin of a woman who had spent 68 years touching things and people in the world with a kindness that asked nothing in return. "Your wife would be proud of you," she said. Ethan looked down at the table. There was a scratch on the surface, long, shallow, the kind that came from years of use, from plates and mugs and elbows and homework assignments and all the ordinary wear of a life lived in a kitchen. He traced it with his finger and didn't say anything for a while. "I don't know about that," he said finally. "I think she'd be relieved. She spent a lot of time worrying about me. She spent a lot of time believing in you. Those aren't the same thing." He started the new job on a Monday. He wore the blue shirt, freshly laundered, properly ironed, the coffee stain finally removed with a peroxide trick he'd found on his phone at 2 in the morning. His office was on his 43rd floor, 2 doors down from Amelia's, and it had a window that faced east toward the lake. It wasn't a corner office, it wasn't big, but it had a door that closed and a desk that was his, and a chair that didn't squeak, and a nameplate that someone in facilities had made, Ethan Brooks, Senior International Contract Advisor. He stared at the nameplate for a long time on that first morning. It was plastic, the cheap kind, the kind that every office in the building had. But seeing his name in capital letters on a door that wasn't a locker room felt like something he needed a minute to absorb. Amelia brought him coffee at 9. "How's it feel?" "Weird." "Good weird or bad weird?" "I'll let you know." The work was hard. Not the intellectual part. The contracts and the legal analysis and the bilingual reviews came naturally, the way breathing came naturally, because his brain had been doing this for years in the dark and was simply doing it now in the light. The hard part was everything else. The meetings, the introductions, the small talk in the break room, where people who'd walked past him for 2 years without noticing suddenly wanted to know his name and his story and how he'd learned to read French. He didn't tell them the whole story. He told them the parts that were easy. Northwestern, 2 years, dropped out for personal reasons. He left out the hospital and the funeral and the 3 years of silence that followed. Some things belonged to him. Some things didn't need to be explained to make a person real. The executives adjusted, some faster than others. Mark, the silver-haired translator, stopped by Ethan's office on the second day and shook his hand and told him that his French was better than half the native speakers Mark had worked with, which was either true or very generous, and either way, Ethan appreciated it. The junior analysts were curious. The senior partners were cautious. The facilities team, the guys he'd worked with for 2 years, the Dannys and the Mikes, and the people who kept the building running while everybody else took credit, they were proud. Danny Kowalski came up to 43 on Ethan's first Friday and handed him a new vacuum wheel, still in the packaging. "Figured you'd want a souvenir," Danny said. Ethan put it on his desk, next to the nameplate. Vanessa Cole was not his friend. She was his boss, and she was demanding and particular and occasionally impossible. And she sent emails at midnight that expected responses by 6 a.m., and she had the social warmth of a Swiss bank vault. But she was fair. She listened to his analysis. She questioned his conclusions without dismissing them. She treated him like a professional, which was, in its own way, a kind of respect that meant more than warmth. One evening, about 3 months into the new job, Ethan was leaving the building at 6 p.m. 6 p.m., the way normal people did, the way people with daylight schedules and kitchen tables where they ate dinner with their daughters did, when Vanessa fell into step beside him in the lobby. "Brooks, Ms. Cole, how's the Dufresne contract?" "Clean, both versions match. Their legal team is better than Beaumont's. No discrepancies, no traps. Straightforward deal." "Good." She paused. They walked through the lobby together, past the security desk, past the reception area, past the marble floors that Ethan had mopped 1,000 times and would never mop again. "Your daughter, how old is she?" 7, almost 8. "Is she doing well?" The question surprised him. Vanessa Cole did not ask about people's children. Vanessa Cole barely asked about people. "She's great. She's reading above grade level. She's got a theory that fish are the bravest animals because they can't close their eyes." Something happened to Vanessa's face. A crack, a fracture. The briefest glimpse of something human and unguarded behind the glass wall she maintained with the same precision she applied to everything else. It was there for half a second, and then it was gone, and her expression was neutral again, and they were walking through the lobby like two colleagues leaving work at the end of a normal day. "That's a good theory," she said. They reached the main doors. The lobby was empty except for the security guard and the night cleaning crew, which was just arriving for the shift. Ethan saw the cart, the same cart he'd pushed for 2 years, with the same bad wheel that Danny had never fixed. A man he didn't recognize was pushing it, wearing the same gray coveralls with a different name stitched on the chest. The new janitor looked at Ethan and Vanessa and stepped aside to let them pass. He didn't make eye contact. He kept his head down and his hands on the cart and waited for the important people to go by. Ethan stopped. "Hey," he said. The janitor looked up, startled. He was young, mid-20s maybe, tired eyes, work boots that had seen better days. The particular posture of someone who was used to being looked through, not at. "I'm Ethan," Ethan said. "I used to work this shift. That left wheel on the cart, it sticks, right?" The janitor blinked. "Yeah, it's been doing it for weeks. I put in a request, but nobody gets to it, I know." Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. His first business cards, ordered the previous week, still crisp and strange feeling in his hand. "If you ever need anything, if you notice anything on these floors that doesn't seem right, anything at all, come find me. 43. My door's open." The janitor took the card and stared at it. Then he looked at Ethan, and something passed between them that didn't require words. Recognition. The recognition of one invisible person by another. "Thanks," the janitor said. Ethan nodded and walked through the doors into the evening. The city was doing what Chicago does in the early fall, turning golden at the edges, the light catching the buildings and the lake in a way that made everything look warmer than it actually was. It was the kind of light that photographers loved and commuters ignored, and Ethan, until recently, had only seen from the inside of a building at dawn, through windows he was paid to clean. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment. Vanessa had already gone, disappeared into a car or a meeting or whatever it was that CEOs did after 6 p.m. The lobby behind him was empty except for the new janitor and his cart and the sound of a bad wheel on marble. Ethan pulled out his phone and called Mrs. Patterson. "I'm on my way," he said. "Tell Chloe I'm picking her up. She's going to be so excited. She's been working on a new drawing all afternoon, a fish in a suit." "A fish in a suit? She says it's you." Ethan laughed, really laughed, the kind that came from somewhere deep and surprised him with its own volume. He stood on Michigan Avenue in the golden light of a Chicago evening, laughing at a picture he hadn't seen yet, drawn by a 7-year-old who thought fish were brave because they couldn't close their eyes. He got in the Honda. It still made the sound when he turned left. He still needed brake pads. The air freshener Chloe had picked out was starting to lose its smell, and the passenger seat had a crack in the leather that he kept meaning to tape. But the car started. The engine ran. The road was open. And for the first time in 3 years, Ethan Brooks was driving toward something instead of just driving away. There's a thing people don't talk about when they talk about starting over. They talk about courage. They talk about second chances. They talk about resilience and determination and all the other words that look good on motivational posters and mean almost nothing to someone who's standing in a grocery store doing math in their head to figure out if they can afford both milk and eggs. What people don't talk about is this. Starting over doesn't mean the old life disappears. It doesn't mean the grief gets smaller or the scars fade or the 3 a.m. thoughts stop coming. Starting over means carrying everything you've been through, every loss, every failure, every night you spent pushing a cart through empty hallways wondering if this was all you'd ever be, and choosing to move forward anyway. Not because you've healed, not because you've figured it out, not because some magical moment of clarity arrived and rearranged everything into a shape that made sense. Because you decided to keep pushing. Because the wheel screams and the floor is hard and there's no water, but you're brave, so you keep trying. Ethan Brooks was never the smartest person in any room. He wasn't the bravest or the strongest or the most talented. He was a man who had lost the thing he loved most and spent 3 years hiding from the pain by making himself invisible. He was a man who found something in a trash can and decided it mattered. He was a father who slept on a couch so his daughter could have the bedroom. He was a janitor who read French case law at 2 a.m, because stopping would have meant giving up the last piece of himself that still believed he could be more. He wasn't perfect, he never would be, but he was visible now, and that was enough. He picked up Chloe. She showed him the drawing. It was indeed a fish in a suit, holding a briefcase with legs. "That's me?" Ethan said. "That's you, Daddy. You're a landfish now. You live on the ground. Do I like it on the ground?" Chloe studied the drawing with the serious consideration of a 7-year-old art critic evaluating her own masterpiece. "I think you're getting used to it," she said. Ethan looked at his daughter, gap-toothed, fierce, wearing a purple shirt with a dinosaur on it that was definitely too small now, and he held the drawing in both hands like it was worth more than any contract he'd ever read. "Yeah," he said, "I think I am."